Okay, let's open it up for questions for both of our speakers. Anyone have any questions? Any comments?
Yeah, thank you both of you for your presentations. I enjoyed it very much. I have a question for Abdallah. I was thinking this was a very nice comparison between the different scholars and their approach to churches, and you were mentioning also Jews and sometimes synagogues, but not, we're not really drawing on that further. So I was wondering if in this chronology that you presented, if the scholars treated synagogues and churches differently at some point, or were they always going in the same, like parallel in the same line? And if they distinguished between synagogues and churches in terms of demolition, renovation, and so on and so forth, what were the criteria to distinguish between Christians and Jews under Muslim rule?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, they don't do this kind of distinctions. They are just calling all, they are putting all these Jews and Christians in the same category. Even some treatises from the later period, from the Ottoman time, because of the limitation of the conference, I stopped on the 15th century. But from the 16th century, there are lots of also interesting, unique examples from the same literature from Ottoman Istanbul. So they specifies more about Jews, Christians, even Zoroastrians. They are also bringing Zoroastrians worship places, but they are putting the same category in terms of Islamic jurisprudence. But they mentioned for the earlier examples, they just mentioned about the Kenise, like just on the Kenise. But for the later period, they mentioned for each Jewish worship places and Zoroastrians as well. But in terms of jurisprudence, it is in the same category. Yes. No. Even sometimes, in some cases, some Muslim scholars, they called the synagogue as a Kanisatul Yahud. So they also use the church as a not only for Christians but also for the Jews as well. That's why their meaning of Kanisa is more broader than we understand now. So they don't. In terms of fiqh and in terms of Islamic jurisprudence, there is no categorically difference.
Any other questions or comments for our speakers? I had a question for Shahnaz. I think it was really, there's been a tendency to look at kind of early Hanafi works and argue. I mean, this goes back to older work by Sherman Jackson and others arguing that Usul al-Fiqh is a later development. So are you in some ways trying to push this to an earlier period, the thinking on Usul al-Fiqh?
Yes, that was definitely part of my thinking in the early stages of my research, and I think it's borne out through the research as I've gone through it. And I think that was part of my point yesterday when I was talking about imposing later models from the classical period onto the formative period. I think their questions and their challenges were different to the classical period, and I think we should be looking for variant models of hermeneutics within that period, and not just assuming that they had the same kinds of concerns as in the classical period. And every sort of aspect, I mean, there are, like you, I would agree that there are continuities for sure. I think, some of the foundations of the law are unchanging, and so that naturally brings out similarities, but there are models there that we haven't unpacked, and they're too easily dismissed because of the early literature around the formative period. But I think we're sort of starting to come out of that. We're starting to come out of that, the obsession with authenticity and attribution and letting those texts speak for themselves. And I think we're discovering that they are of their time and they do have something different to say. So yes, I would push back on that thesis a little bit, yeah.
I had a question for Abdullah, actually. Abdullah, you mentioned Suyuti silencing Salafi authority. How does he do this in this treatise? And I'm assuming, has this treatise been published? Okay.
Just during my research, actually, I discovered his treatise. I was assuming that already published, but all these like kind of like huge encyclopedias, all the other stuff, the CMR and other stuff, they don't. Until today, they was mentioning we are missing this treatise. So just recently discovered. So I'm hoping with like. This attending this conference also make a reason for publishing soon. But in terms of your question was about his using of
how he silences.
How his silences. Yeah, actually, its position quite different from the earlier examples. Because the earlier examples they have specific issue, but when we come to the Suyuti, there is no, especially according to his like treatise, there is no specific reason for writing this treatise. So that's why his perspective is more broader than the others, because for their case is like there is a specific kanisa, and just for this kanisa there is like some judicial issues. That's my position from my side. I say that. But in Suyuti's case, it's different. It's bringing more like broader perspective. In terms of referring to the earlier authorities, he's also referring to the same, in some cases, the same references to do some fundamental Shafi doctrinal books, but at the same time he goes to the different conclusion in terms of like more. He has more tolerance according to the Ibn Taymiyyah and the others, and he also opens a door for the future treatises as well. And when we go through after Suyuti. Suyuti, one of the rare examples from the Shafi school. When we go to the Hanafi school, I found them really flexible, really tolerated, especially the scholars from Istanbul, Ibn Kemal and Hüsam Çelebi. They all, even in some cases, they compare like church with the mosques. How we are dealing with the mosque. So this is a waqf, this is a foundation. That's why we have to put in the same category the church and the mosques. So at that level of like tolerance, they use.
Is that the Ottoman context or the Hanafi context? I'm wondering if pre-Ottoman Hanafis in the Mamluk period do they sound more like the Shafi'is on this question or not?
Actually, these are the questions I'm actually asking my dissertation. But still, I'm looking for some answers about it, because in terms of like all Hanafi and Ottoman scholars, they are more tolerated. But when we come to the Ibn Nujaym, for example, from the 16th century, he's Hanafi, but he's not really tolerated as much tolerated the Ottomans. So it is interesting when we bringing like Ottoman background and the Hanafi background, it comes something different. So. It is, I'm hoping also to find some more examples to contextualize from the Hanafi and Shafi scholars as well. So,
Sorry, just because you're doing the Hanafi-Shafi comparison, I mean, given your talk was very close to Dr. Melchert's, but he's really looking at Shafi'i, and you're looking at the Hanafi texts, how do you see the different hierarchies when it comes to the Salaf in kind of Professor Melchert's presentation and then your early Hanafi texts?
I would say that Shafi'i text deserves its own treatment. It's often how people have spoken about Shaybani is as a precursor to Shafi'i, but I think they were dealing with similar questions but came up with different answers. And so in service of Shafi'i's mission to kind of include as much prophetic hadith in the corpus of revelation as possible, or in the corpus of his primary sources as possible, he does treat companions and the Salaf in a different way, I think, to Shaybani. And I think Shaybani's epistemic principles are different to Shafi'i. So this idea of majoritarian reports over minority reports, even those that are seemingly attributed to the Prophet, are a distinct difference. But in the legal arguments themselves, and I think this is where the confusion comes with Shafi'i in terms of reconciling some of his legal arguments with what he's got in the Risala and some of these later treatises, it's not quite as simple to create a legal system if you're just taking in any and every hadith that is attributed to the Prophet. And they have similar reasonings in terms of, using the rulings and understandings around witness as a way of, sifting through evidence and sifting through proof. And that really bears out in Shaybani's arguments and his epistemology, but not as much in Shafi'i's Risala, I think. So there are clear differences in their treatment of the Salaf for different reasons. But I don't think Shaybani is just a precursor to Shafi'i in that sense. I think he had his own distinct answers. And the Hujjah is really a work that bears that out. So yeah, I think there's more to be said on that, but I can't do it justice, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
I just have a quick comment just on what Shahnaz was saying. First of all, these were both really great presentations. I really appreciated them both. But on some of the things that you were getting at in terms of putting your paper in conversation with Professor Melchertz, and then you're thinking then through Shafi'i and you're thinking through Shaybani, and I really like the way you just phrased it right now, that they were dealing with the same problems and came with very different answers, and that there is an epistemic difference between the two as well. And I think one of the things that came out in just as a note in terms of your presentation as well, that when Shaybani, of course, is speaking about hadith, it's very much this majoritarian hadith as opposed to lone narrator hadith and so on. But in addition to this, similar problems, different solutions, epistemic differences as well, there are certain things that Shafi'i is holding on to that I think Shaybani isn't. And I think that not just Shaybani, but Shaybani and Malik and Shafi'i's predecessors aren't, and that this is a problem for Shafi'i himself, that he's trying to foreground, and that's actually the priority of divine revelation, then equating prophetic narrations of the same status, the same probity, the same hujjiyah. And so there's a sense with Shafi'i that the hakimiyya of God and then the Prophet are of equal footing. So of course this move of raising hadith then to that. And then in doing that, the other adillah shari'ah fall in rank. And so the question then is the prophetic, is the companion, because the fatwa of a sahabi, is it hakimiyya in the same way that something from the Prophet is? So in other words, are they speaking on behalf of the divine in the same way that a prophet is? And I think that's one of these tricks in understanding the difference between Shafi'i and his predecessors that often gets looked over and hasn't really been teased out, is that he centers hakimiyya of God, and then by extension to the Prophet. And then in doing so, it makes him rearrange the adillah shari'ah in a way that his predecessors don't.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I was reluctant to get into the theological questions surrounding Shaybani's legal methodology, because I feel like that's an entirely, separate project. Not separate, but as in it could be a project on its own. But this was a common question that came up in my mind all the time. Was Shafi'i more committed to an idea of a divine law than Shafi'i and some of his compatriots. And I don't think that is the case as far as I can see. I think that the way Shaybani is protective about the Quran and about the Prophet's words shows something to the contrary. I can't speak for the other proto-Hanafis because, again, I think that requires separate projects. But at least for Shaybani, the way he looks at the language of the Quran, that, you know, nothing can impede the general statement of a Quran, not even prophetic traditions, shows a sanctity for, you know, a sanctification of the Quran that is on par with what we see with Shafi'i. When he doesn't accept, you know, minority reports from the Prophet, it's not because he is dismissing the Prophet, but because arguably there is an indication there again of the sanctity of the Prophet's words and what that means in relation to the law. So companion traditions can give us an idea of what the law is, but that gives the law much more flexibility than if you put it in the mouth of the Prophet. And I think there are those, and again, it's the same questions but different answers, and an equal commitment to the divinity of the law, I think, personally, from what I've understood so far. But, you know, there's a way to go.
Thank you. It's very heavy.